Hi, I'm Frederick and I'm the founder of Family Quilt and wanted to welcome you for our second live on Facebook. Last week we talked about where Family Quilt came from and where the idea came from, and I talked a little bit about myself, about my dad having given me the idea when I heard some of his stories. So this week we're going to talk about something a little bit different. We're going to talk about how we can help you with Family Quilt collect your best, or not even your best, but your family stories and memories. But before we get on, what actually can you do on the app, etc., I wanted to talk a little bit about memories and stories and who actually has stories and memories to tell. Now, I think it's pretty straightforward. I think most people kind of think, when you think about memories and stories, you think about older people, you think about your parents, you think about the fact that they have lived for a very long time and therefore they have a lot of stuff to talk about. And as I said last week, this is very much how Family Quilt started, because I heard some of my father's stories and I realized that actually there was lots of things I didn't know and I wanted to hear more. And obviously he's got a very full life. He's lived for 91 years actually, so he's got 91 years worth of stories. And so that kind of sounded like a really good kind of place to start. I think this is kind of clearly a lot of people out there that have got so many stories to tell. Anybody really over the age of 70 or so have got plenty to say. And actually that reminds me, I don't know if any of you has listened to the BBC Radio 4 programme that was on Sunday at 1:30. Guy Garvey actually talked about the 10 years he spent recording his father's stories. It's only about a half an hour program, but it is actually incredibly moving and it is amazing. You hear some other recording of his dad and he talks about how much he got out of recording his father, how much his father enjoyed it, but also how much for him it meant in terms of finding out more about his father and having stories that he can now share with his son, and is kind of therefore part of who the family is all about. So anyway, parentheses that was. So, but if you haven't listened to this program, would definitely recommend you do. And so for sure, starting with stories of, let's say, older people is a good place to start. But it would be really sad if we thought that the only people that have got stories to tell are people who are over 70 years old. So I'm going to start at the complete opposite end, and I'm going to say I think there's a lot of stories to be told about very young children. And I think for many of us who have got children, we kind of know how it happens. Baby comes along and it's uber exciting, and we go into photo mania. And I think in particular these days when we've got mobile phones and videos kind of on demand, it's very, very easy to record numerous photos and numerous videos of your children. And I think I did the same, except that for mine, my youngest son is 21. So at that time, it was more like we had to have a proper camera. We didn't have, kind of mobile phones. But nevertheless, we have boxes and boxes of photos of the two little ones, when they were little, and memories. And I think all of those photos are fabulous. But I think they also kind of are great to a point, because there gets a point where your little one stops being just a pretty baby and actually starts to do things, and they start to walk and they start to talk and they start to have adventures of their own, and actually recording those, the stories, not just recording the photos, becomes all the more important. And I think that, I remember we had, Tom, particularly my little, had lots of little stories when he was young at school, and, the first kind of sports game you attend, the first day when they go to school. Their lives are kind of have so many first things that they do. There's also the funny little words, the kind of distorted words. I know my eldest son used to call a tomato bematos, which, was kind of really quite sweet at the time. So you've got the funny words, you've got the naughty times, you've got the weird, kind of, or the wonderful family occasions when you do things together, the walk in the parks when special things happens. And in all of those kind of instances, actually, whilst photos are wonderful, they're not actually going to tell the stories. And then you fast forward like I did, 21 years, because Tom was 21 in September. And you try to remember, and actually it is really quite hard to remember. Now we did gift him a quilt for his 21st with all the best memories that we could remember of his young life. But I think that now, knowing what I know, and with Family Quilt, it probably would have been easier to start when Tom was that much younger, or even Jack actually, and whether we could have collected stories that we went along, that one day we could have given them, the stories, the memories of their childhood that they never knew or never remembered, because they were too young to remember. So I think there are some wonderful stories to be captured when you have children that are growing up, for yourself and for them, as part of something you can gift them when they have grown up. I think though it's not just about the children, and I think even anybody really, even people my age, and I'd like to think that I'm not that old, even if I'm obviously not that young, we have stories to tell and things to remember, that we want to capture, that we would actually probably in the future hate if we couldn't quite remember exactly what was happening. And I think we've all lived, we've all been young, we've all grown up, we've all had bust up with our parents, we've all, had school friends and school dramas, we've all had first boyfriends or girlfriends, we've all left home at some point, and gone and lived on our own. And all of those moments in our lives are amazing moments and amazing memories. And I think that if we can capture some of those, they clearly are a part of who we are. But it's not just about the stories of our own past that are worth capturing. We have stories that happened last week, last month, or might happen next week, next month. I mean, we're about to go into Christmas, and generally at Christmas, it's a time when families come together. We get around a table and we have a lovely dinner and we have a good laugh, and sometimes we reminisce. But things happen in those kind of Christmases, and having memories of Christmas is a wonderful, a wonderful thing to capture. Some of us actually also might be making, photo books. I mean, I know in our family, we've made photo books of every year, actually, since 2003. So we've kind of gone a little bit down the way of capturing some of the memories. And I really love it from time to time, when we curl up on the sofa with my husband and we kind of go through the various photos, and, we see the boys when they were little and we see them growing up, and we see ourselves getting a little bit older over time. But hey ho, that's the way life goes. But actually what we miss when we go through all of those is we don't have the stories anymore. And we have, the memories and the photos, but not the stories. So it is wonderful if you can capture a little bit more, so that one day when you kind of browse through it, you can have all of it, not just the pictures, but actually the stories. And that's really what, I think is inspiring about Family Quilt. Is yes, we started by thinking that it was about older person. Well, I certainly started to think it was about older person because I thought it was about collecting the stories of my dad. But as we've gone along and I've told the stories to a number of people around me, I was told I was too narrow, that I needed to think bigger, and that lots of other people had stories to capture, whether it was of their children or of their own lives. And I think that was a very fair point. So to all of you, and you may recognize yourself, who have along the way of the journey I've gone through told me that I needed to be a little bit more open-minded about who may want to capture their stories, I would say thank you, because I think it is true. There are many, many stories to be told. It's not about age. It's actually just simply about capturing the stories and the memories, whether you've been alive for 1 year or you've been alive like my dad, for 91 years. So hopefully this has kind of made you think that, there is something in Family Quilt for everybody. Now, I know when we talk about stories, what we tend to get is people said, Fred, I am so busy. I have so many things to do. I just don't have time to do it. And I think that's fair. I think that, capturing stories is an investment. There's no doubt about it. And I would be lying to you if I said that it isn't an investment. But what I also would like you to think is that there is so much reward to be had from having those memories and having those stories and being able to browse them now and for the years to come, and having something that you will have forever, whether it's your parents' stories or whether it's about your children's memories. So yes, it is a little bit of investment, but it has, it also is a huge amount of reward. And I'd like to think that with Family Quilt, we have really tried as hard as we could to make it really easy for you to record your stories. I also would say to you that, the stories you tell can be as short or as long as you want them to be. This isn't about, either winning a literary prize. Actually, it really is all about capturing the memories for yourself. In the app, you can always go back and edit your stories. So when you have something that comes to mind, the best way is to just sit down and get going, get writing, get recording, and actually, see where you get to. Come back to it later if you need to. When you read it, if you think, oh my God, this was terrible, you can always delete it. And if you think, gosh, that is not really the way I would have wanted to tell the stories, you can always edit it. So there is no need to be all hyped up and all nervous about writing a story. I think this is much more about trying to be spontaneous and getting it down one way or the other, or out one way or the other. And then you can come back later and look at it. The other question that people ask a lot, or comment that people ask a lot, is around getting started. And I think that's really quite fair, actually. And I had a little bit that way. You have this little bit of a writer's block, and you kind of think, gosh, where do I start? What am I supposed to write about? So to help you with that, in the web app, we've actually got, I think it's over 150 questions that can help you get started. And the questions are really quite broad. I mean, there's some questions about your family, your parents, your grandparents, what memories you may have of them. There's stories about growing up and what it was like, memories about you at home and you with your parents and the chores you may have been doing in your house. There's some questions about your own families. They question about, what you're doing with your children, what you spend your weekends doing, the best holiday memories you may have. There's also some cheeky questions about things like about your first time, your first heartbreak, your first kiss. And there's some stuff around, also kind of your work life, if you've been working, or wisdom, if you're a bit of an older person and you have views about the world. Or hi, Caroline, thanks for joining. So there is some stuff there to help you get started, and hopefully that way you don't have this kind of writer's block, and you can get going as quickly as you wish to. Now, when it comes to actually how is the app, what are the features on the app to kind of help you? Let's just start with the kind of the very beginning. I mean, we have tried to make this so simple. For me, when we were looking at what it would need it to be, I wanted my father to be able to use it. And as I mentioned last week, my father at the time was 90 years old, and not only that, he's French, so he doesn't speak English. And therefore, we needed to have kind of colors and simple words that he would be able to recognize. So it is incredibly simple. What you can do when it comes to recording a story, all you have to do is to click either on the question from the inspiration kind of list that we have, or to just click on the Add a Story tab, and the screen will open and you can put in a title and you decide, am I going to write my story or am I going to record my story? And then it's a simple click on the button and get started. I was really keen to have the ability to write or to voice record, partly because I think some people, are good writers or feel very comfortable with writing but would feel terrified of voice recording, and vice versa. I know that my father has found it really easy to write, particularly because he's got Parkinson's, so that makes it a little bit harder for him to speak. But I also know that, my mother-in-law has enjoyed at time voice recording. And I think voice recording is really interesting because I will have, you can have the voice of the person, and my mother's voice recorded as well, actually. We will have some voice recording of their stories, and their voice will be with us forever. Voice is also really interesting if you ever wanted to voice record your children. And I remember actually it was more like a holiday we took when the boys were younger, and I have some recording of Tom speaking over a kind of a walk that we did. Obviously he was a boy, he was about 12, his voice was super highly pitched. At the time we lived in Australia, so he was an incredibly ridiculous Australian accent. And actually when you listen to it now, when his voice is broken and he has lost his Australian accent, it's a very different voice to record. So actually voice can be a really lovely thing to keep memories in, as well. So you can either write or you can voice record. Then what we really wanted was, hi Claire, thank you for joining, that's really lovely. The other kind of feature beyond that is about how you can view the stories. Now, I was really happy in a way when a friend of mine, when we were kind of developing the stories, and I have various friends that I went to and I said, look, what do you think? Is it a good idea? Is it a bad idea? What do you reckon? And I had this friend of mine, a lady called Heather, and we were chatting about it, and she said, Fred, how are people going to be able to view their stories? And I hadn't really thought about it at the time, and I thought, well, I don't know, and she said, look, there are some absolutely lovely way where people can kind of scroll through stories that would make it really interesting and emotional for people to have a look at the stories. And so she basically kind of showed me a website she looked at, and that was really very much the inspiration for the quilt. The quilt is how you can physically see your stories as you build them. So every time you file a story and you save it, not as a draft, but as a proper story that you're happy with, it goes on your quilt. And the quilt is basically a patchwork, lots of little squares of your stories, one at a time. Every little time you have a story, you can see at the very beginning the first few lines of the stories, and you can then click on them and you can view the whole stories. And it basically builds just like a patchwork, just like a quilt would, basically, one story at a time. And it makes it really, really lovely to actually look back at your stories and scroll through them. And as you get more and more stories, and it can get a bit harder to find some of the stories you might be keen to look at, you can then decide how you want to view your stories. You can view them by the date you've added them. You can view by the date they've actually happened, because when you capture your stories, you can put a date if you want to, or you can view them by categories. I mentioned we have 150 questions. We've put them under 7 different categories, so you can choose what kind of categories if you want. Again, you don't have to, but you can do that, and that can help you, later on, view your stories. Now, the other feature that was really important is we wanted to be able to share the stories. And actually, I can see, Caroline, you asked me if somebody living in Australia can view your stories. And the answer is yes, they absolutely can view the story, your stories, if you have chosen to share with them. And that's important. Your stories can be very private. Some people may decide they don't want to share, for a long time. And, but some other people might want to actually do this and share straight away and get their families involved. So it really is the choice of the storyteller what they want to do with the story. And if you decide you want to share, you just go in the account tab and you put in the email address of the people you want to share with. It doesn't matter where they live. And every time you file a story, they will then get an email that will alert them to the fact that you have filed a new story. So they can then log in with their own login details and their own security, and they can view your quilt. And there they can they can click on the story and they can read your story. What's lovely as well is they can comment on the story. And that can be quite nice, because sometimes you may share with people in your family who were also there at an event. I don't know, let's say I was sharing about my wedding day, and I wanted to share this, and my sister, with my sister or my parents, obviously they were there on my wedding day, and they will have their own memories of that day, or, they might actually think that my memories are a bit weird and actually a bit wrong, and so they may want to put me right. So you have the ability to put a comment if you want to about the story. So that kind of makes it nice. And the other thing that people can do when you've chosen to share with them is they can actually ask you a question. So let's say, I don't know, particularly with your parents, you wanted to ask something very specific about some memories you'd heard, but you didn't quite remember the stories, or a part of their lives that you don't know much about. You can actually type the story as a kind of a person that is being shared with, and they will then get an email saying that you have asked them a stories, and then they can get going and write the stories. And when they've written the stories, then you will know they have, because you will get an email. So that sharing functionality is really important, because one of the things we felt we wanted to do was to bring families closer together. And this is a really lovely way to bring families together, whether it's you and your husband, your parents, your children, your grandchildren, whoever it is that you are. You really have the ability to kind of create a kind of a collective kind of memories of your family stories, and that was kind of really, to me anyway, that was really exciting. The other kind of feature that I was going to mention on the app is that you can gift it. I thought that was important, because, as I started thinking about it with my father, but actually it works the same if you had a friend that had a baby and you wanted to gift it to them. I think it's a lovely thought. It's a lovely gift. If you were going to, if you stuck for a Christmas present for your parents, and I know many of us, I know my parents has had 91 years of Christmas presents, and certainly from my end, a few years. I'm not going to say my age, but a few years. And so, it's always tricky to get good ideas. I think we wanted to be able, to have Family Quilt as a gift. What it says in a way to your parents is, look, I care. Please give me a little bit more stories about your life. I want to know a little bit more. So we thought that would be a lovely gift for parents. But again, if you have friends that are having babies, and you want them to start, and you feel that's a good idea to capture stories of their children as they grow up, it can also be a lovely present to give to a friend, as a kind of baby shower, or as a parent to a daughter or a son who is having a baby. So these are the main features, and hopefully today, no, I forgot to say, I think the best way, if you really want to understand how well family works, a family quilt works, would be to go on our website. And the address is, if you just Google familyquilt.net, and you'll be able to see, what we're all about. We've tried to put a couple of little videos to tell the story about what we are about, and we can show, you can see a quilt being scrolled through. If you go, there is a tab that's called How It Works, and there you will get a lot more details, and you will hear again, or see more like it, some of the things that I've just kind of been talking about. So if you are interested, please go and have a look. Visit us on familyquilt.net and find out a little bit more, about how Family Quilt works. So we're coming to the end of our chat, and I've just got a question. Now, hold on, I have to click on see more. Yes, so I think the idea is, the question that's coming in is, when you have elderly parents, how easy is it for them to use the app, and things like keyboards. So what I would say is that, first thing I would say, we have tried to make it so easy, so that my dad could use it. So it is incredibly simple to use. If you want to type, and you can type slowly, you can type, and take for a long time. I know my father takes a long time to type. This is okay, because you can save it as a draft. You can always come back, you can always edit. There's no pressure to have it right in the first time. But if you don't want to type it, or if you're not confident with a keyboard, all you need to do, when you go on the app, is click actually on the voice record. And if you are on a desktop or an Android, you will be able to then basically start recording the story, and it just will ask you to use the microphone of your computer, and you click yes, and then click on record, and off you go. And at the end of it, you stop recording and the file gets uploaded. It's just going to ask you to add a few words about what the story is about, so that when you look at it in your quilt, you can see what this was all about. So hopefully it is really incredibly simple, and is easy to use, whether you want to type or not. So I hope, Caroline, I've answered your question. So we are coming to the end of our second kind of chat. I hope that I've inspired you I've got another question. I've got to answer that one. This is the last minute. Could my 10-year-old make one of her grandparents make one for her grandparents' Christmas? Absolutely. So if you wanted to give this to your if you have a child that wants to give a grandparents present, I think this is a brilliant idea, actually. But I would say that, I suppose. But I think it's a really lovely idea, because I think that every time I've talked to people who have got grandchildren, they are so excited about their grandchildren. They so, in a way, would love, their grandchildren to know more about themselves, but they are terrified of sounding boring and old-fashioned. And so actually, if you have, a grandchild gifting this to you, I think it doesn't get any better for a grandparent. So yes, you can absolutely do that. So there you go. So I'm just going to finish now, and I just hope that in the few minutes we've spent together, well, actually quite a long time actually thinking about it, I have inspired you to think about the stories you can tell of your life, whether it's asking your parents to tell their stories, or it's about the stories you can tell about your children growing up, or just the stories of the life you have lived and you are living. And I hope I've inspired you to look at our website, because we have really tried to make it wonderfully easy for everybody to do it, so they can enjoy this kind of collection and sharing and reminiscing with their family. So this is it for this week. Thank you for listening, and I see you next week. Bye now.